Welcome to the turning point. There comes a moment, not with noise, but with silence, when the one who once tried to control you realizes they can't anymore. That's when everything shifts. At first, they noticed your empathy, and they mistook it for weakness. They mistook your kindness for an open door. But they never understood that true strength is measured not in how loudly you speak, but in how firmly you stand, especially when you're standing alone. Neuroscience shows us that our brain is built for survival, but it's also built for growth. When you begin to recognize the patterns of emotional manipulation, your brain starts to light up with awareness. You stop reacting. You start observing. And observation is power. You stop explaining yourself. You stop questioning your worth. You start protecting your peace like it's oxygen, because it is. That's the moment their illusion collapses, because the narcissist's game only works if you play. And now you're no longer in the arena. You've stepped out. You've risen above. They push, you pause. They provoke, you stay grounded. They expect chaos. You choose calm. That stillness, that unshakable presence, that's neurological resilience. That's a nervous system no longer hijacked by emotional turbulence. You're not cold. You're clear. You're not distant. You're decisive. You're not angry. You're aware. And once you see clearly, there's no going back. The narcissist will feel it. They'll sense the strength they can't touch anymore. And that moment is freedom. A narcissist is not simply someone who desires attention or admiration. At the core of narcissistic behavior lies a fragile sense of self that demands control as a mechanism of survival. While on the surface it may appear that such individuals are seeking connection through charm, persuasion, or even acts of seeming generosity, their deeper psychological and neurological motives are wired toward dominance, not bonding. This misunderstanding often traps empathetic people in relationships that feel warm at first, but slowly evolve into environments filled with confusion, self-doubt, and emotional fatigue. To understand how narcissists operate and how one can build resistance to their influence, we must explore the neurobiological and psychological dynamics at play. The human brain is fundamentally designed for connection. Regions such as the anterior cingulate cortex, insula, and mirror neuron systems allow us to feel what others feel, to empathize, and to bond. In healthy individuals, these networks support mutual understanding and secure attachment. However, in narcissistic individuals, particularly those with narcissistic personality disorders, NPD, there's often an underfunctioning or miswiring in these regions. They might intellectually understand empathy, but emotionally they struggle to activate it genuinely. Instead of using relationships to co-regulate and build mutual trust, they use them to regulate their own image and self-worth, often at the expense of others. Control becomes their oxygen. They feel most secure when they're the one setting the emotional tone, dictating outcomes, or dominating attention. This doesn't always appear as aggression. Often, it's subtle withholding affection when you assert yourself, love bombing when you start to pull away, or feigning vulnerability to regain sympathy. These tactics are not random. They're strategic, unconscious adaptations to protect a fragile ego. The narcissist's nervous system is hypersensitive to threats of abandonment or inferiority, even when such threats are imagined. When someone close to them displays independence, confidence, or emotional clarity, it triggers insecurity. In response, they tighten control. This control can manifest in many ways: gaslighting, guilt, tripping, passive-aggressive behavior, or triangulation, where they involve third parties to manipulate your emotions. Over time, these tactics can wear down your sense of reality, making you question your judgment and rely on their approval for self-worth. What begins as a bond gradually turns into a system of control. But here's the important neurological and psychological distinction: connection is based on reciprocity, while control is based on asymmetry. Healthy connection requires both parties to feel seen and valued. It thrives on openness, vulnerability, and emotional safety. Control, on the other hand, needs imbalance. One person must feel smaller, unsure, or dependent for the other to feel in command. The narcissist, rather than being fueled by love or respect, is often driven by dominance and validation. Their sense of self is built on the mirror of others' reactions. If you're sad and they cause it, they feel powerful. If you're happy and they're not the reason, they feel threatened. This is not to say all narcissistic behavior is deliberate or malicious. In many cases, it is deeply unconscious and rooted in early developmental trauma. A child who learned that love was conditional, or that they had to perform, impress, or dominate to receive attention, may carry that into adulthood, shaping a personality organized around self-protection, not emotional intimacy. From a neuroscientific standpoint, their limbic system, Zeller, which regulates emotional reactivity, may be overactive, While the prefrontal cortex, responsible for emotional regulation and long-term reasoning, may struggle to override these impulses. This imbalance keeps them in a cycle of short-term emotional wins at the cost of long-term relational stability. Understanding this helps you depersonalize their behavior. It's not about you, it's about their need for control to feel safe. That clarity is your first form of power. Once you recognize that their behavior isn't rooted in true connection, you can begin to withdraw from the game. You stop seeking validation from someone who can't provide it. You stop trying to prove your worth to someone who needs you to feel unworthy. And most importantly, you start reclaiming your cognitive and emotional space. When you reclaim that space, something powerful happens in your brain. Your amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for emotional reactivity, starts to settle. Your prefrontal cortex engages, helping you think more clearly and set boundaries with confidence. Your dopamine system begins to shift as well. Instead of seeking highs from external approval, you find internal reward through self-respect, autonomy, and emotional clarity. This neurochemical shift is fundamental. It means you're no longer addicted to the narcissist's intermittent validation. You've recalibrated your brain to prioritize peace over performance. This transformation doesn't just free you from their control, it often triggers a reaction from them. Because remember, narcissists don't connect, they control. When their usual tactics no longer affect you, when your nervous system doesn't flinch at their silence, when your mood no longer pivots on their approval, that's when they realize they've lost their grip. This moment can be confusing or even enraging for them. You're no longer predictable. You're no longer playing the part they scripted for you. This realization often drives them to test you again, to bait you emotionally, to provoke reaction, to draw you back in. But once you've seen the difference between connection and control, it becomes easier to resist. You understand that real relationships don't require you to shrink, perform, or apologize for having boundaries. They don't demand your silence when you're hurting or your loyalty when you're being devalued. Real connection honors your individuality. It doesn't fear your strength, it celebrates it. In the end, your greatest protection is education, understanding the mechanisms behind narcissistic behavior. From their psychological roots to the neurobiological systems that sustain them, gives you clarity. And clarity breaks cycles. When you see manipulation for what it is, you stop personalizing it. You stop internalizing it. And that space, that break in the pattern, is where freedom begins. Remember, the moment you stop being controllable, you become untouchable. Not because you're cold, but because you've grown. And the narcissist, they can't follow you where emotional maturity lies. Because control doesn't survive in the presence of real connection. And now you know the difference. Self-awareness is not just a trait, it is a skill. One of the most powerful tools a human being can develop in the face of manipulation. Especially when dealing with individuals who thrive on control, such as narcissists, self-awareness becomes both shield and sword. It allows you to see beyond the mask others wear and the games they play. More importantly, it allows you to understand yourself so deeply that external tactics, no matter how subtle or aggressive, lose their grip. Manipulation depends on your confusion, on your unconscious triggers, on your willingness to doubt your own perception. But once you cultivate self-awareness, those doors begin to close. What is self-awareness in this context? It is the ability to observe your own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors without being swept away by them. It is knowing your values, your emotional needs, your default responses, and your vulnerabilities. It is recognizing when you're being triggered, and instead of reacting, you pause, analyze, and choose your response consciously. This is not just a psychological process. It is a biological one. The more you strengthen this reflective capacity, the more your brain's prefrontal cortex engages to regulate emotional impulses coming from the limbic system. That's the science behind what feels like emotional maturity. Why does this matter when dealing with manipulation? Because manipulators, especially narcissists, look for emotional blind spots. They test your boundaries subtly at first, then more aggressively. They mirror your values to gain trust. They probe your emotional wounds, perhaps abandonment, rejection, or unworthiness, so they can position themselves as the cure to your hidden pain. Without self-awareness, you don't see this happening. You feel the pull, the emotional reward, but you don't yet understand the cost. And that's how manipulation starts in silence, beneath your awareness. But the moment you begin to study yourself, everything changes. You start to recognize the patterns. You notice how certain compliments make you feel special and how you may chase that high again. You notice how guilt used to keep you compliant, and now you question why. You start observing the cycle, how someone treats you poorly, then offers intermittent kindness, and how that unpredictability once kept you emotionally invested. With self-awareness, those dynamics lose their power. You start to name the game, and when you name it, you can stop playing it. Boundaries, once fuzzy and reactive, become clear and intentional. You know where you end and where someone else begins. You learn how to say no without guilt because you understand that your value does not come from how much discomfort you tolerate for others. You stop over-explaining. You stop trying to fix people. You begin to see that it's not your job to absorb the emotional chaos of someone who refuses to regulate themselves. And most importantly, you stop feeling responsible for other people's reactions to your truth. One of the most important functions of self-awareness is emotional literacy, the ability to name what you feel and why. Without it, emotions control you. With it, you learn to regulate, you understand when you're being emotionally hijacked, and you give yourself the space to return to center. That space is everything. It's the moment between stimulus and response where freedom lives. Manipulation depends on your emotional impulsivity. But if you slow things down, if you get curious instead of reactive, the manipulator loses access to your decision-making process. When dealing with someone who uses tactics like gaslighting, guilt tripping, or love bombing, self-awareness acts like a mental firewall. You stop internalizing every accusation. You begin asking, is this really about me, or is this their projection? You check your reality against facts, not feelings. You stop giving instant emotional access to people just because they demand it. You start protecting your energy the way you protect your time, your health, your future. This shift in perception doesn't happen overnight. It's a process. But every time you pause before reacting, every time you journal through your confusion, every time you reflect on what a situation is teaching you about yourself, you are rewiring your brain. You're shifting from survival to sovereignty. You are training your nervous system to stay grounded in situations that once caused you to spiral. That is strength. That is evolution. Self-awareness also makes you a mirror that narcissists and manipulators find uncomfortable. Why? Because your clarity reflects their lack of it. Your boundaries confront their sense of entitlement. Your ability to stay grounded denies them the emotional reaction they seek to control. It's not uncommon for narcissists to become more aggressive or dismissive as your self-awareness grows. They may accuse you of being selfish, cold, or distant, but that's just a reflection of their shrinking influence. You're no longer reacting from old wounds. You're responding from wisdom. Another key aspect of self-awareness is accountability, the willingness to own your part in any dynamic. This doesn't mean blaming yourself for someone else's behavior. It means asking, what patterns in me attracted or tolerated this? Where did I ignore red flags? Where did I seek validation from someone incapable of offering it consistently? These questions aren't meant to shame you. They're meant to liberate you. Because once you understand how you got caught in a pattern, you gain the power to break it permanently. Ultimately, self-awareness is a form of self-love. It's the courage to face yourself, to sit with discomfort, and to rise above it with insight and clarity. It doesn't mean you'll never be hurt again, but it does mean you'll never stay in spaces that keep hurting you. It means you can walk away from manipulation, not with bitterness, but with wisdom. You can say, see what's happening here, and I choose peace over confusion. I choose truth over performance. I choose myself. This level of strength can't be faked. It's felt. It radiates in your tone, your decisions, your boundaries, and your silence. And those who once thrived on your unawareness will feel it deeply. They may try to regain control. They may accuse, provoke, or suddenly act remorseful. But when you are rooted in self-awareness, you are no longer shaken by the storm. You are the calm in it. That is when you realize manipulation isn't something you need to fight. It's something you outgrow. And once you've outgrown it, it can no longer reach you. That's not just emotional intelligence. That's freedom. And freedom begins the moment you become aware. The human brain is a complex system of circuits, chemistry, and adaptations designed for both survival and growth. Among its many parts, the prefrontal cortex, located right behind your forehead, is one of the most critical regions when it comes to higher order thinking. It is responsible for judgment, planning, reasoning, and most importantly, self-control. When this part of your brain is active and healthy, you can assess situations calmly, think long-term, and resist being overwhelmed by sudden emotional impulses. This becomes incredibly important when dealing with toxic individuals, particularly those who thrive on emotional manipulation. Because their influence doesn't just target your emotions, it targets your biology. Narcissists and other manipulative personalities are masters of emotional provocation. They operate in ways that trigger fast, impulsive reactions in others, responses that bypass the rational brain and activate what's called the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm center. When the amygdala is activated by perceived threats, such as rejection, criticism, or confrontation, it can override the prefrontal cortex, sending your mind and body into survival mode. This is where people often make decisions they later regret, sending a defensive text, breaking down in tears, apologizing for things they didn't do, or spiraling into self-doubt. That is exactly where a manipulator wants you, off balance and emotionally reactive. In that state, you're not thinking with clarity. You're not evaluating truth or protecting your boundaries. You're just trying to survive an emotional storm. But when you activate your prefrontal cortex through awareness, mindfulness, and mental clarity, you interrupt that cycle. You create space between the stimulus, what they said or did, and your response, what you choose to do next. And in that space lies your power. The prefrontal cortex is what allows you to pause and ask, is this person trying to confuse me? Is this conversation going in circles? Am I being gaslit? Are my emotions being used against me? When your prefrontal cortex is online, you can notice patterns rather than fall into them. You can resist the urge to defend yourself unnecessarily or get sucked into arguments designed to distract from the real issue. You can recognize when someone is playing on your fear of abandonment or guilt and choose not to react impulsively. This brain region is strengthened through repetition and practice. Just like lifting weights builds physical strength, engaging your prefrontal cortex builds mental and emotional strength. Practices like journaling, breathwork, meditation, and even strategic pausing in heated moments help fortify this part of the brain. When you train yourself to slow down your reactions, you're not suppressing emotion, you're regulating it. And regulation is key, because emotional hijacking only happens when you've lost the ability to choose your next move. In relationships, especially with narcissists or emotionally toxic individuals, they will often test your prefrontal control without you even realizing it. They may use intermittent reinforcement, switching between affection and criticism, to keep your nervous system on edge. They may pretend to be vulnerable to draw you in, then blame you when they don't get the reaction they want. These patterns are meant to destabilize your thinking. But when your mind is trained to pause, to observe, and to delay reaction, their tactics begin to lose their power. This isn't about becoming emotionless or robotic. It's about developing a calm mind that isn't easily shaken. It's about using the prefrontal cortex as your internal compass, one that doesn't point toward drama, but toward truth. Clarity fuels the prefrontal cortex. That's why confusion is a manipulator's greatest tool, and clarity is your greatest weapon. When you are clear about who you are, what your boundaries are, and what is acceptable behavior in your life, your brain responds with strength. It quiets the internal chaos. It chooses the higher road. It walks away when necessary without guilt. Science also shows that chronic stress, especially emotional stress from toxic relationships, weakens the functioning of the prefrontal cortex over time. This means the longer you stay in environments that cause anxiety, fear, and self-doubt, the harder it becomes to think clearly and make healthy decisions. This is why so many people feel stuck in toxic dynamics. They're not just emotionally overwhelmed, their brains are neurologically drained. But the good news is that the brain is plastic, it can heal. The more you remove yourself from toxic stimuli and practice cognitive discipline, the more your prefrontal cortex regains strength. Another fascinating aspect of this brain region is its connection to empathy and moral reasoning. When healthy and activated, it doesn't just help you protect yourself. It helps you act with integrity. You stop lowering yourself to someone else's level. You stop retaliating out of anger. Instead, you move from emotional noise to grounded clarity. And that makes you unshakable. You begin to realize that silence can be a decision, distance can be an answer. And walking away doesn't mean you lost. It means you chose peace over chaos. You also begin to recognize red flags sooner. You spot patterns of emotional manipulation not after months, but after moments. Because your mind is no longer clouded with confusion or desperation for approval. It's clear, it's present, it's strong. This kind of mental clarity makes you unattractive to those who rely on control tactics to feel powerful. And while they may try harder at first, because your clarity disrupts their system, they eventually retreat. Because they can no longer hijack your emotions. They can no longer bypass your logic. They can no longer bend your boundaries. They've lost access to your nervous system. It's important to understand that your brain is not your enemy. It is your ally. But like any system, it needs the right inputs. If you constantly feed it chaos, it will adapt to chaos. If you feed it calm, discipline, and clarity, it will begin to thrive in those states. So when you feel tempted to respond emotionally to someone's manipulation, ask yourself, is this coming from my limbic system or from my higher brain? Am I reacting out of fear or responding out of awareness? Every moment you choose clarity over confusion, every time you activate your prefrontal cortex by pausing, breathing, thinking, it's a win. Not just for your mind, but for your entire life. You're training your brain not just to survive, but to lead. And that is the kind of strength no manipulator can touch, because when your mind is no longer reactive, your peace becomes your power. And once you know how to access that part of yourself, no one can take it from you again. Detachment is often misunderstood. In emotionally intense relationships, especially those involving manipulation, narcissism, or toxic dynamics, detachment can be mistaken for coldness, avoidance, or even weakness. But the truth is far more empowering and deeply rooted in neuroscience. Detachment, when practiced from a place of awareness, is not an escape from emotions. It is a discipline of the mind. It is the art of observing rather than absorbing. It is not a defense mechanism. It is a reflection of inner maturity and neurobiological regulation. When you detach, you are not shutting down your emotions. You are choosing not to be controlled by them. This distinction is vital. The emotional brain, the limbic system, has the ability to hijack your perception of reality when triggered. In toxic relationships, especially those with narcissistic individuals, this emotional hijacking happens often. Manipulators use words, silence, praise, and criticism in cycles to confuse your nervous system. This constant emotional stimulation wears down your capacity for rational thought. You begin to feel addicted to the highs of approval and the lows of rejection. Over time, your brain becomes conditioned to chaos. But detachment is how you reverse that pattern. It is how you reclaim your space. In neurological terms, detachment engages your prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for executive function, logic, and self-control. When you detach, you give this part of your brain space to lead. You pause, you breathe, you think. And in that process, you are regulating your entire nervous system. You are calming the fight or flight response that was once triggered by someone else's mood or manipulation. Detachment says, I see what's happening, but I won't participate in it emotionally. You can acknowledge someone's behavior without letting it define your emotional state. You can understand someone's pain without making it your responsibility. You can listen without absorbing. This mental posture is not avoidance. It is awareness. It is not apathy. It is clarity. It is the realization that your peace is your power, and anyone who requires you to sacrifice it for the sake of a relationship is asking you to betray yourself. In emotionally manipulative relationships, the most common tool used against you is emotional reactivity. The manipulator wants you to yell, cry, chase, prove yourself, or defend yourself. Why? Because your reaction gives them feedback, attention, and power. Your reaction keeps the dynamic alive. Detachment disrupts that cycle. When you respond with stillness instead of rage, with silence instead of panic, the game ends. The manipulator loses control, not because you fought harder, but because you didn't fight at all. You chose not to engage in dysfunction. That is not weakness. That is mastery. And this mastery is measurable in the brain. Research in neuroscience shows that people who practice mindfulness and self-regulation exhibit higher levels of heart rate variability, a marker of a flexible, resilient nervous system. They also show decreased activation in the amygdala during conflict and greater activation in the prefrontal cortex. In simple terms, their brains and bodies don't get hijacked by stress as easily. They maintain clarity even under pressure. This is what detachment trains you to do. It helps you respond instead of react, reflect instead of absorb, and remain centered instead of being pulled into someone else's chaos. Learning detachment often requires unlearning the belief that love equals sacrifice or emotional enmeshment. Many of us are conditioned to believe that caring for someone means being emotionally fused to them. That if they are angry, we should feel guilty. If they are unhappy, we should fix it. If they withdraw, we must chase. But that is not love. That is codependency. Detachment breaks this pattern by teaching you that you can care deeply while staying grounded. You can love someone and still say no. You can be compassionate and still walk away when your peace is threatened. The power of detachment lies in the quiet decisions. Choosing not to reply to a baiting message. Choosing not to explain yourself for the 100th time. Choosing to leave the room instead of escalating the argument. Choosing to unfollow, delete, or block when someone refuses to respect your boundaries. Each of these actions is an act of self-preservation, and they all require a regulated nervous system and a calm, engaged prefrontal cortex. That's what detachment strengthens over time. And of course, detachment is not the absence of feeling, it's the mastery of it. You still feel hurt, you still feel hurt, you still feel disappointed. You may still feel love, but those emotions no longer dictate your behavior. You are no longer a puppet pulled by the strings of external approval or disapproval. You are centered in your own values. You are grounded in what you know is true. You act with intention, not compulsion. This internal alignment is what gives detachment its quiet strength. The irony is that those who manipulate others often interpret detachment as a threat, because it is. It threatens their ability to control, to provoke, to dominate. It signals that you are no longer emotionally accessible for their games. They may try harder, they may lash out, they may attempt to guilt, trip you, or re-engage you. But when your detachment is authentic, rooted in emotional regulation, not in fear, they will feel the shift, and they will know you are not weak, you are awake. One of the greatest benefits of practicing detachment is the clarity it brings. You start to see the truth of who people are, not who you wish they were. You see how much effort you were investing in dynamics that never gave back. You realize how much energy you were spending trying to make someone change, love you better, or finally understand you. And you stop, not because you've given up on love or connection, but because you've returned to yourself. You've remembered that your emotional well-being is not something to be bartered, begged for, or broken in someone else's chaos. Detachment becomes a form of mental freedom. It allows you to walk away, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Not to punish, but to protect. Not to control the outcome, but to let go of what is no longer aligned with your peace. And in that letting go, you don't shrink, you expand. You find strength not in the noise, but in the stillness. And that stillness becomes a sanctuary no manipulator can enter. This is not a state you reach once and forever hold. It is a practice. It is choosing every day to return to yourself, to regulate, to breathe, to walk away from chaos and toward clarity. And every time you do, you become stronger, not louder, not harsher, just stronger in the most quiet, grounded, and unshakable way. Because detachment is not giving up. It's waking up. And once you've awakened, you will never again mistake reactivity for strength or emotional entanglement for love. You will know that the ability to stay calm, to walk away, to remain unmoved, that is not weakness. That is mastery, and that is freedom. Confidence is not just a feeling. It's a biological shift in your entire system. When you begin to trust yourself, believe in your choices, and validate your own worth without the need for others' approval, something profound happens inside your brain. The way your neurons fire, the way your body responds to stress, and the way your reward system operates begins to change. This isn't just psychological empowerment. It's a neurochemical transformation. At the center of this shift lies a key player in the brain's reward system, dopamine. Dopamine is often misunderstood. It's not just the pleasure chemical. It is deeply involved in motivation, reinforcement, and learning. It's the chemical that teaches your brain, this action leads to reward, do it again. In relationships, especially toxic or manipulative ones, your dopamine system can be conditioned to chase unhealthy highs. The intermittent validation, the rare moments of affection, the temporary approval from someone emotionally unavailable. These moments may feel exciting, even addictive, because they light up your brain's dopamine pathways. But over time, this creates a dangerous dependency. When you rely on someone else's approval, praise, or affection to feel good about yourself, your brain is outsourcing its reward system. It's essentially saying, I will only feel motivated or happy when this person gives me validation. This is how manipulative individuals maintain control, by controlling the emotional environment and the rewards you receive. It's not unlike an addiction cycle, periods of emotional deprivation, followed by bursts of affection or attention. And just like with any addictive cycle, the brain starts to crave the hit, even if it knows the source is unhealthy. But the moment you begin to turn inward, when you stop looking to others to tell you who you are, everything begins to change. Your dopamine system, which once responded only to external cues, begins to rewire itself around internal reward. You start to feel good when you follow your intuition. You feel energized when you respect your boundaries. You feel a sense of achievement when you say no and mean it, or when you remove yourself from toxic dynamics without guilt. These internal wins begin to generate dopamine, not because someone clapped for you, but because you honored yourself. That's confidence. And that confidence literally changes your brain. Scientific studies have shown that self-efficacy, your belief in your ability to manage life and its challenges, is strongly correlated with increased prefrontal cortex activity and balanced dopamine signaling. When you act in ways that affirm your self-worth, your brain begins to associate confidence with reward. It learns that certainty in your values brings peace, and peace becomes the new high. You no longer chase approval, you create alignment. You no longer wait to be chosen, you choose yourself. Confidence also creates resilience. A confident mind doesn't crumble under criticism or collapse in the face of rejection. Why? Because its reward system is not dependent on the outside world. Confidence says, I am enough, even if you don't see it. I am valid, even if you disagree. I am worthy, even if you walk away. This doesn't mean arrogance or stubbornness. It means emotional independence. It means your dopamine is no longer held hostage by others. This inner wiring also makes you immune to manipulation. Manipulators feed off your need for reassurance. They test your self-esteem by withdrawing affection or pushing boundaries, knowing that most people will break just to feel accepted again. But a confident person doesn't break. They observe. They pause. They reflect. Because they understand that discomfort is temporary, but betraying yourself has long-term consequences. They know how to sit with rejection without redefining their value. This isn't just emotional strength. It's neurobiological evolution. Your brain is always learning. It learns what feels good. It learns what brings relief. And it adapts to patterns you reinforce. If you repeatedly reward yourself for shrinking, pleasing others, or tolerating poor behavior in exchange for crumbs of validation, your brain will learn to associate those actions with dopamine. But when you start reinforcing a new set of behaviors, such as walking away, speaking your truth, or prioritizing peace, your brain rewires. It begins to generate dopamine from strength, not submission, from clarity, not confusion. This transformation takes time and intentionality. It requires self-awareness to notice when you're falling back into approval-seeking behaviors. It requires discipline to pause and redirect your energy inward. It requires compassion to forgive yourself when you slip and courage to keep choosing alignment over attachment. But with every decision you make that honors your inner truth, your brain takes note. It says, "This matters. This feels right. Do it again." And slowly, confidence becomes your new baseline. You'll also notice changes in your physical body. Confidence reduces cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone. It calms your nervous system, making you less reactive, more present, and more at peace. Your posture changes. Your tone of voice becomes more grounded. You speak not to prove, but to express. You listen not to fear rejection, but to understand. All of this happens because the brain and body are deeply interconnected. When the mind becomes centered, the body follows. Eventually, you stop craving the validation that once ruled your decisions. You stop over-explaining. You stop chasing relationships that require you to perform. You begin to surround yourself with people who respect your inner world, not just your outer performance. And the relationships you build from that space, they are authentic. They are nourishing. They are not based on manipulation, fear, or emotional depth, but on mutual respect and shared truth. The beauty of this transformation is that it's available to anyone, regardless of the past. You don't need anyone else to believe in you first. You don't need permission to start. All you need is a willingness to turn inward, to rebuild trust with yourself, to reward your own truth, and to rewire your brain's relationship with worth. The more you choose self-respect over people-pleasing, the more your confidence grows. And with that confidence comes clarity. And with clarity, freedom. Because once your brain learns that your value comes from within, no one can ever take it from you again. That's not just emotional power. That's neurochemical freedom. That's confidence, rooted, unshakable, and entirely your own. There comes a moment in your inner evolution where something quiet but powerful takes place. It doesn't come with drama or confrontation. It doesn't happen in an explosive argument or a grand declaration. It happens in the silence of your nervous system. It happens when you no longer feel the need to react, to explain, to defend, or to participate in emotional games. That is the moment the cycle breaks, not because they changed, but because you did. When your emotional system stops feeding the cycle, their power disappears. Narcissists and emotional manipulators depend on your reactivity. They rely on your need for resolution, your longing to be understood, and your willingness to emotionally engage, even when the engagement is painful. They feed on your confusion, your outrage, your repeated attempts to be heard or to be validated. Every time you react, they feel seen. Every time you explain yourself, they feel important. Every time you seek closure, they feel control. But the moment your emotions stop rising to meet their tactics, their structure begins to collapse. This is not just a psychological shift. It's a physiological one. The human body and brain are wired for connection and survival. The emotional brain, the limbic system, is constantly scanning for safety and threat. In toxic relationships, especially those involving narcissistic behavior, the nervous system is repeatedly activated. You become hypervigilant, alert, always prepared to defend yourself or anticipate the next manipulation. Your body begins to live in survival mode, and your emotions become the currency of the relationship. But when you begin to detach, not just physically, but emotionally, your nervous system starts to regulate. You begin to experience peace not as a temporary escape, but as a new baseline. Your breath deepens. Your thoughts slow down. The obsessive need to fix, to prove, or to win someone back begins to fade. That internal stillness signals a deep neurological shift the cycle of addiction is breaking. At the core of every toxic relationship is an invisible emotional contract. One person agrees to perform, to please, to chase, or to soothe, and the other agrees to dominate, control, withdraw, or provoke. This contract is often unspoken but deeply felt. The narcissist plays the game by pushing emotional buttons. And the more you react, the deeper the cycle becomes. But the second you choose not to play, when you stop taking the bait, the contract dissolves. This act of stepping out doesn't always look like walking away physically. Sometimes, the most powerful form of breaking free happens within. It's when they say something cruel and you don't flinch. When they bait you with silence and you remain calm. When they distort the truth and you don't feel the need to correct it. When they test your worth and you no longer need to prove it. That is the moment they feel it, the loss of access to your emotional system, the loss of control. This change doesn't come from hatred or bitterness. It comes from clarity, from the understanding that no amount of emotional effort will ever change someone who is invested in dysfunction. From the realization that your energy is sacred and not everyone deserves access to it. And from the deep, lived truth that peace is better than proving, that calm is better than being right, that silence can say more than shouting ever could. Breaking this cycle also rewires the brain. Neuroscientific research shows that repeated emotional stress strengthens certain neural pathways, particularly those associated with fear, anxiety, and reactivity. But when you begin practicing stillness, awareness, and non-reactivity, the brain creates new pathways. Your prefrontal cortex becomes more active. Your amygdala, the fear center, becomes less dominant. This means you start responding from wisdom, not from wounds. Narcissists and toxic individuals don't know what to do with someone they can't provoke. Their tactics rely on predictability. They know which words hurt you. They know how to withhold affection at just the right moment. They know how to praise you when they feel you slipping away. It's a cycle of control, not connection. And when your nervous system no longer dances to their rhythm, they are left confused, unsettled, powerless, because the real power was never theirs. It was yours. It was your reactivity, your energy, your emotional investment. And when that investment is withdrawn, not in anger, but in neutrality, they begin to feel their own emptiness. Because without someone to mirror their sense of importance, without someone to absorb their chaos, they are left with themselves. And that is the one place they don't want to be. That's why they fight so hard to keep you in the cycle. Even if they pretend to discard you, they'll come back with a new mask, a new role, a new tactic. But you'll see it clearly now, because your vision is no longer clouded by need. You've outgrown the illusion. Outgrowing emotional games doesn't mean you stop feeling. It means your feelings stop controlling you. You can feel sadness without falling into despair. You can feel anger without losing your center. You can feel love without losing yourself. That emotional maturity is what makes you powerful. Not louder, not colder, just deeply anchored. This kind of transformation doesn't need to be declared. You don't need to post about it. You don't need to prove it, because the people who used to pull you into chaos will feel it. They will sense the quiet boundary, the inner fortitude, the calm refusal to engage. And that more than anything is the moment of truth. It is the moment when the narcissist realizes they no longer have access, not just to your time, but to your nervous system. They can no longer throw you off balance. They can no longer ignite your fears. They can no longer feed their ego through your reactions, because you are no longer in their cycle. You've outgrown the emotional game. And with that, their grip disintegrates, not because you fought harder, but because you evolved. The most powerful thing you can do in a toxic dynamic is not to fight for dominance or justice. It is to rise beyond the game entirely, to see it for what it is, and to choose your peace over their chaos. That choice is not passive. It is the most active form of freedom. It is the signal to your brain, your body, and your soul that you are no longer willing to be pulled into someone else's emotional storm. And in that moment, quiet, clear, and deeply rooted, you reclaim your life, not with noise, but with power.